Welcome to this press briefing on the sidelines of the AU summit. That's the 38th Heads of State Summit that begins today all through to the 16th. The reason we're hosting this briefing today is for a number of reasons. It is in line with the theme for this year's African Union Summit, and that is justice for Africans and those of African descent through reparations. And one of the ways perhaps to ensure justice for that is through what has become a key conversation over the last couple of years, maybe, which is reforming the global financial architecture to making sure that it's equitable, particularly for those that need it the most, particularly for those that have contributed the least to matters like the effects of climate change, but continue to bear the brunt of it, amongst other issues. But it also takes a look at the lending system and how fair and equitable that is to African countries and those of the global south, and trying to situate this as an important part of the summit that is being discussed, that is being held in Addis as we speak. And so today you're going to hear from experts and those who have taken the time to study this, and we're going to be looking at what reforming that global system looks like, why it is important, and of course, most importantly, especially now considering the geopolitics that is happening with what we see with Trump 2.0, amongst other things that are taking place even across Europe. So what does that look like, and what should AU's position be? Can the AU have a collective position? Should they? All of these are there. So we'll be having the speakers, but most importantly, all of you who have joined, we kindly remind you that this is your session, so you can ask as many questions as you can. Please put that in the chat so that you can get to hear from those here. Also, remember, there will be a recording of this that will be available to you after this session is done. I encourage you as well to continue to speak with the experts that we have lined up for you, getting their contacts. There might be some good points of insights as you continue to work on your stories. So thank you all for being here. Again, just in the chat box, please just let us know who you are and where you're from. There is translation in French and Portuguese, I believe. So welcome to all of you. Let us know where you are, who you are, and what sort of areas you cover as well. Okay. So let me begin by just giving you a brief about our speakers today. First, we have Adrian Chukwuore, who's a senior Pan-African advisor at Christian Aid. He's got expertise in public policy, research analysis of both public and private finance. Then we've also got Dr. Theophilus Jong, who is a policy and advocacy manager at African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, otherwise known as AfroDad. He's a development professional with some great experience in program development and management, as well as monitoring and evaluation. He has a doctorate and a master's in development from the Nelson Mandela University, so somebody well-versed in that area. Last but certainly not least, we've got Sarah Maka, who's an Africa Executive Director at the One campaign, and she leads One's advocacy and strategic engagement with key stakeholders. And of course, that includes deepening the participation of people and citizens from all walks of life towards ensuring justice for all. So those are our speakers today, and perhaps the best place to start is where I ended with the introductions. Sarah, over to you, and perhaps in just a few minutes that you've got, speak to us about what this topic means. So there's been lots of talk about reforming the global financial architecture system. We've had several presidents, including the Kenyan president, really pushing that as a Pan-African agenda. What does that mean, particularly in the context that we're in and in the work that you are doing?
Absolutely. Thank you, Yvonne. And I'll say good morning to our journalists who are here. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. And I wanted to start with the import of your presence. As Africa navigates the current moment we're in geopolitically, the media's role is more important now than ever. If you don't continue to put a spotlight on what we're talking about, on the implications of our conversations for the average everyday citizen, I think that we do not get to a place where we can be proud of the Africa that we have. I think both the citizens and the leaders need your voice. So I'm really grateful to be in this session with you. The Africa Union Summit is kicking off today, as Yvonne mentioned, and the theme is around justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. And I think that theme of justice is very important. Africa is standing at a very pivotal moment for our economic future. We are seeing the geopolitical impact of the new America. We are seeing that catch on with Europe. As we speak, many countries have already started dropping their support to other countries. The far right journey is politically, we're seeing that people are a lot more excited about looking into their country and saying, let's take care of ourselves first. Why are we paying attention to others in other places? And that's why the voice of Africans, the leaders, journalists, citizens is now needed more than ever because we have to organize our house. Now, with the AU's focus of leaders throughout the continent, we want them to focus on the global financial architecture. The reason why this is a justice conversation is that the current global financial architecture was created in the 1920s, 80 years ago, in the 1940s, and African countries were colonies. And the design of the system that exists did not incorporate the sovereign African nation that we have today. So we are abiding by rules that are antiquated and actively push African countries back from developing. And if we can't have capital, adequate, cheap, appropriately priced capital, then we don't have a conversation to start about our advancement and our development, because the end of the day, the anchors of any country's development rest in her ability to get funding. So funding becomes a very critical issue. You know, they say, if you want to know about a person, show me how their money works. If you want to know about a country or continent, tell me how their money works. How do they get in money? How do they spend their money? How do they retain their money? The cost of capital issue is urgent and it's important. And the reason why it's timely is South Africa is leading the G20. Now, the G20 was created over 20 years ago, and the purpose of the G20 was to equate and balance the global economy. It's very important to know why it existed. The global economy needs to be regulated by a body. The first time Africa is in charge of setting the agenda for the global economy. And we sincerely believe that South Africa's role is on behalf of the rest of the continent. The AU is also part of the G20 and became a part of the G20 about a year and a half ago. So the AU is still understanding its role, is still getting up to speed. So South Africa's leadership holding the pen is critical. And what we're requesting and demanding for is we need to investigate why there is a bias for African countries when it comes to the global economy and the global financial architecture, especially as to the price of capital. We're currently in a debt crisis at the moment. 25 countries pay more to service their debt than they pay for health and education combined. Now, that's a problem because we're trading off our development for paying debt. And we often say, one, Africa doesn't have a debt problem. We just have a high cost of debt problem. African countries pay 500% more than other countries to go into the capital market. When a country like Senegal or Greece have the exact same credit rating, which is priced in the risk, and they go to the capital market, the market dings Senegal and supports Greece with the exact same priced in risk. So we have to have questions as to why this is and what can be done about it. And we have to elevate our voice and demand that until action is taken, we will not rest and we will not relent. And so that's why this AU summit is really important. I'll end by saying, when African presidents gather, we want the African citizens to be excited because the actors of our continent are in one space and they can collectively make an impact. We want this message to be sent to the African Union. It is not enough that they gather. They need to be able to project the inspiration that we need as citizens of the continent. We can look up to a group of elders and leaders because the rest of the world is taking care of itself. And we are looking to those presidents and leaders to ensure that they take care of the 1.4 billion people on this continent. I'll end here.
Thank you, Sarah. I've got so many follow-up questions from that, but I'll have Adrian speak first. You've laid the ground with it, the role of South Africa and the G20. We'll come back to a lot of that because that G20, particularly in a Trumpian world and others, says a lot different. But Adrian, tell us what this means. So justice for Africans can be achieved through reforming the global financial system?
Thanks a lot, Yvonne. Good afternoon, good morning from wherever you are. Indeed, there is a nexus between the reform of the global financial architecture as well as reparative justice. As you would know, the legacies of slavery, colonialism, apartheid, and even neo-colonialism have left deep scars on African societies and even its diaspora. The historical exploitation and injustices have resulted in profound socioeconomic implications, which continue to shape and devastate the continent today. And we believe that the African Union is uniquely placed to lead the continent's call for reparations, advocate strongly for justice on the global stage, ensure that the voices of affected communities are sufficiently represented, and that meaningful solutions are implemented. So what does it take to move towards, the reform of the global financial architecture vis-a-vis reparative justice? I think the first point of call would be debt cancellation and the reform of the global financial architecture itself. Why do I say so? The current global financial system has deep historical roots in the equities of colonialism. It is basically dominated by international financial institutions such as the IMF as well as the World Bank, but this also includes global capital markets, which are heavily influenced by philosophical positions that prioritize market liberalism, creditor dominance, and resource extraction. After decades of extractivism on the continent's resources, these institutions have contributed far more to the inequalities and destitution that we see in Africa. And because of their conditional lending policies that have come in the guise of economic reforms, this has led to, unrest in a number of African countries as a result of, the unfair and unpopular policies that we see. In technical terms, we call them austerity policies. And we've seen the implications of the same within Kenya in the last year. But then there is a role for the AU to play with regards to the same. And I believe African countries need to pursue decoloniality of the IMF and the World Bank, which are institutions which were created before many African countries gained independence. And as such, were and are still not representative of the continent, as African countries did not participate in the governance architecture. The governance of the IMF and the World Bank are dominated by wealthier nations, with voting power determined by financial contributions rather than equity or development needs. African countries have very little voting power, with less than 10% voting share and represented by only 2 executive directors. These imbalances have marginalized Africa and the global South, and with their needs often overshadowed by priorities of the global North. As such, there is need for the AU in coordinating African countries, in the context of having to promote alignment of African countries' positions in global spaces such as the UN, financing for development, and even the G20 that my previous colleague has spoken about. And this has to be within the realm of debt cancellation and the establishment of a multilateral debt resolution framework or workout mechanism, where all nations have got an equal voice and can establish a more representative architecture for the reformed international financial architecture. Whilst we speak about the UN processes, it's also important to note that the African Union, through one of the Abuja treaties, actually created its own financial architecture. It's also important to strengthen that so that we can be self-sufficient. It is also important to note that, debt cancellation and reform of the global financial architecture can also be coupled by lobbying the UK government on cancellation of private sector debt, as most debt owed by countries to private creditors is governed by English law. Private creditor legislation from either the UK or the US could unlock progress and lead to greater debt cancellation for African governments. The majority of African debts and other debts of low-income countries is likely owed to private creditors, and this is basically governed within English law. So a push by the African Union to engage with its northern foes would be key in ensuring that movement goes ahead. Secondly, I think there is a good or important component around the need for fair public climate finance as reparations. You know, the global north countries, development has been driven by carbon-intensive industrialization, right? And this fueled resource extraction from Africa and has had disproportionate effects on the continent. So there is now need to ensure that African countries also, leapfrog from the crisis it is facing with regards to climate change. We have heard of the various cyclones with very different and various names, the droughts, the locust waves, amongst others. These need to be resolved, and finance is at the core of the same. So one plea that can be put on the table is to ensure that the AU and the Africa group of negotiators be consistently aligned on the need for climate finance to be delivered predominantly as grants and not loans. The provision of this finance is a moral obligation, the payment of an ecological debt owed by historical emitters to countries that have played little part in causing the climate crisis, but are on the front line of the impacts. This needs to be addressed, and the reform of the global financial architecture translates even into the climate finance architecture that needs to be resolved. I think I'll pause here for further engagement, but thanks and over.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. Some interesting food for thought. Decoloniality of the IMF, World Bank, and others. Some important points to note. What that actually means, we'll come back to that. And by the way, just a quick reminder, I'm seeing your questions in the Q&A box. Lilies, Njeru, Bob, Etemiku, we will get to those. So I'd encourage the rest of you as we go along, put your questions in there. We're just going to pose them to our speakers in just a moment. Dr. Theo, this conversation around reforming the global architecture, but what does that mean in terms of perhaps reforming our own? Do we need to strengthen our own before we can talk about reforming the global one? Your thoughts?
Sorry, thank you, Yvonne. I hope everyone can hear me. I think Sarah and Adrian have actually set the pace on these issues and highlighting some of the central issues when it comes to issues around reforming the global financial architecture. And I will come from a point of giving it more context in terms of the historical precedents that actually then also connects with this issue of reparative justice, for African countries. Of course, in terms of reforming the global financial architecture, like you said, Sarah, this is something stemming from a historical context where African people have actually not just been dispossessed, but their voice, has actually been taken away in terms of, contributing policy decisions of rulemaking, within the global financial system. When it actually comes to institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank that play a key role, when it comes to issues around financial governance, you see that the laws are actually and the rules are actually set by the colonialists. They're actually set by those who actually put African countries through slavery, through colonialism, and through the current global financial system, that is more extractivist, I'll say, that actually preys on African countries, preys on African resources. So reforming the global financial architecture actually does not only mean looking at the financial institution per se, because we also have here non-financial institutions that are key players in this process. For instance, the OECD countries, they have informal arrangements like the Paris Club members. These are actually key decision makers when it comes to issues of lending, when it comes to bilateral creditors, and they have, significant influence, in the policies of the IMF and the World Bank. You will know that actually the IMF is actually a European led institution, while the World Bank itself, the prerogative is of the US president to actually appoint who sits there. And you see the kind of disequilibrium when it comes to actually power sharing collective decision making in these institutions. And then you find that in this process, African countries are nowhere to be found when it comes to setting the rules, when it comes to making decisions. It is actually he who pays the piper, that calls the tune in this system. And reforming the global financial architecture actually requires that we move away from these arrangements to more democratic arrangements, right? For instance, you heard Adrian talk about the financing for development process, which actually goes through the UN, where there's actually equal representation for countries when it comes to making decisions around global financing, around how African countries can actually access the finance, a scale that you require not just to implement the sustainable development goals, but the national development plans. And we're also talking here about Africa's Agenda 2063. So it is about giving African countries more voice, changing the rules of the system, right? And you have heard of the Mbeki report, how much African countries actually lose in terms of illicit financial flows out of the continent. This is also due to the distorted system. And today we have come to a point where there are technological, developments that actually facilitate, these processes. And we know where these resources are going to, right? We know the tax havens. We know where the beneficiary owners of these companies that perpetrate illicit financial flows. We know where they sit, and we understand the mechanisms that countries actually use, to siphon these resources out of African countries. And reforming the global financial architecture actually requires, concerted effort to actually seal these leakages, because this is also what causes African countries to reach their hands each time, borrowing until they get to points where they have debt burdens that they're unable to actually service. Of course, reforming the global financial architecture also means reforming these institutions, not just the rules, but the structures. And this is why we're also recommending that it should involve, going through the United Nations. Because when you look at the multiple crises that African countries have faced, it's part of the outcome, of this system that has been extractive, of African countries for several decades, not just for several decades, dating back to issues around slavery and slave trade through colonialism. And this is where the issues of reparative justice come in this entire discussion, because reparative justice here is not just about giving African countries money, but actually reforming these policies, right? Because it's not just about giving us money. It's not just about tokenism, like we say. It's not just about reaching out huge sums to pay for that, but the reforms of the global financial architecture and these issues around reparative justice should take into account issues of institutional reforms. It should take into account the fact that the global financial system has actually been built out of the sweat, out of the blood, out of the contributions of African countries and out of the extractivist economy that has actually been imposed on African countries by those who are actually leading the global financial system. And we can see this adequately. These countries have managed to use this system to keep themselves ahead of the rest of the world, right? Keep themselves arrested the rest of the world, not just in terms of their economic power, but also in terms of their political power, in terms of their ability to actually impose decisions on African countries and and the global South. And this ties then, as part of reforming the the global financial architecture, what we call at Afro, that Africa as a rule maker, not just a rule taker, in this global financial system. So reforming the global financial architecture actually requires that we look into these things that I just mentioned, and this idea of reparative justice should actually take into account these structural reforms as part of, actually reforming the global financial architecture.